somewhere in a Chinese data center, a cluster of Huawei Ascend 910B accelerators is grinding through a large transformer training job. The same class of workload, the same batch size, the same model architecture that an Nvidia H100 handles in a Western facility. The bullish read says China just built a chip that closes the gap with the world's dominant artificial intelligence hardware maker. The skeptical read says the numbers are a press release, not a benchmark, and closing a gap on paper is not the same as closing it under load. The export restriction that was supposed to end China's artificial intelligence hardware run instead redirected it, and the round that should have been a knockout reopened the fight. 4 scored rounds will determine which read survives contact with evidence, raw compute, memory bandwidth, software ecosystem, and yield and cost. Round 1 is raw compute, and the bullish side opens strong. Huawei's own published specifications for the Ascend 910B place its peak brain floating point 16 throughput in a range that, on paper, sits within striking distance of the H100. For a chip developed under successive rounds of export controls, that specification represents a generational compression of the usual development timeline. The bullish side calls it proof of concept at scale. The counterclaim cuts immediately. Peak floating point ratings are marketing arithmetic. They assume full utilization of every compute unit, 0 memory stalls, and a workload perfectly mapped to the chip's instruction set. Real transformer training achieves a fraction of theoretical peak on any hardware. The fraction matters more than the ceiling, and the ceiling is the only number Huawei has published. Here is the evidentiary problem. Huawei's brain floating point 16 peak figure is the company's own claim. As of mid-2025, no independent machine learning performance submission from a Huawei Ascend cluster has been published by a neutral benchmarking body. The gap between rated and realized throughput on production training workloads remains unverified. The H100, by contrast, has published machine learning training results from multiple independent submitters, giving it a documented realized throughput floor. The absence of equivalent third-party data for the Ascend is itself an exhibit in the case against the bullish read. Round 1 to the skeptics. A specification without an independent benchmark is a claim, not a result. The H100 has a documented floor. The Ascend 910B does not yet. Round 2 moves to memory bandwidth, and the contest shifts terrain. Large transformer models are memory-bound long before they are compute-bound. The argument from the bullish side is that if the Ascend 910B's high-bandwidth memory configuration is competitive, and Huawei's published spec suggest it is in the same order of magnitude as the H100, then raw floating point deficits matter less than the bandwidth feeding them. The chip that moves model weights fastest wins the workload. The counterclaim is architectural. Memory bandwidth specs, like floating point specs, are measured under ideal conditions. What determines training speed is sustained bandwidth under the access patterns of real attention layers. Irregular, non-sequential, sensitive to cache hierarchy. Rated peak bandwidth is the highway. The question is whether the on-ramps can match it. An attention layer does not read weights in tidy sequential blocks. It reaches across memory in patterns that punish shallow cache hierarchies and reward deep architectural integration. The evidence here is more granular than a spec sheet, but less authoritative than a controlled benchmark. Reports from Chinese research institutions and early Ascend adopters suggest the 910B's memory subsystem performs competitively on workloads that fit its access patterns, but struggles proportionally more on workloads with irregular memory access. These observations are not peer-reviewed benchmarks. They are practitioner notes circulating in the Chinese machine learning community. Still, they are more informative than rated figures, and they point to bandwidth as a partial bright spot rather than a clean win. Round 2 split, awarded narrowly to the skeptics. Bandwidth on paper is credible. Sustained bandwidth under production access patterns lacks the third-party validation needed to call it a victory for the Ascend. Round 3 is software ecosystem, and this is where the adjudication becomes least comfortable for the bullish side. The claim from Huawei's supporters is that the compute architecture for neural network software stack has matured rapidly. Major Chinese artificial intelligence frameworks, including adapted versions of PyTorch and domestic alternatives, now support Ascend hardware natively. Domestic hyperscalers have financial incentive to make their workloads run on Ascend, and engineering effort has followed that incentive. The gap that was enormous 2 years ago, the argument goes, is now narrowing at measurable speed. The counterclaim names the real competitor. CUDA is not just a toolkit. It is a decade of practitioner knowledge, third-party libraries, debugging infrastructure, profiling tools, and hiring pipelines built around a single programming model that became the lingua franca of deep learning. A model team switching from H100 to Ascend does not merely swap a driver. It requalifies every compute kernel, reprofiles every training bottleneck, and retrains every engineer on a new mental model of hardware. The switching cost is an ecosystem tax that the raw specs do not capture. Maturity and parity are not synonyms. This is the round where the evidence most clearly favors the skeptics, and awarding it otherwise would misread the record. CUDA's PyTorch compatibility has improved substantially. Huawei's public developer releases document this, and Chinese academic groups publishing Ascend-trained results corroborate it. But the breadth of third-party library support, the depth of profiling tooling, and the volume of practitioner debugging knowledge embedded in over a decade of CUDA development represent a structural lead that no single software release closes. The asymmetry is not permanent. It is real, and it is present. Round 3 to Nvidia, and it is the clearest round of the 4. Software ecosystems compound over time. Huawei is compounding faster than expected, but the base remains smaller, and the compounding advantage runs in Nvidia's direction for now. Round 4 shifts to yield and cost, and here the bullish case recovers ground on unexpected terms. The argument is not that the Ascend 910B is manufactured more efficiently than a chip from Taiwan Semiconductor. It is that the H100 is simply unavailable to Chinese hyperscalers under current export controls, and the Ascend is. A domestically available chip at higher cost per floating point operation is not a consolation prize for a buyer who cannot access the alternative. It is the only prize. Huawei's chip, manufactured at Semiconductor Manufacturing International on a process node that trails the leading edge, but has been optimized for volume, ships to Chinese customers. That fact alone closes certain arguments. The counterclaim addresses sustainability. Manufacturing at a trailing node under tooling constraints is not a stable cost position. Reports suggest Ascend 910B yields are lower than comparable chips manufactured at Taiwan Semiconductor at equivalent design complexity, a consequence of process maturity gaps that do not disappear quickly. Lower yield means higher effective cost per working chip. The total cost of ownership argument for Ascend, to the extent it holds, depends on domestic subsidy rather than manufacturing efficiency. Subsidized competitiveness is real in the short term. It is fragile in the long term. The yield figures for Semiconductor Manufacturing International's advanced node production are not publicly disclosed. Analyst estimates vary widely, and they are estimates, not audited numbers. What is documented is that the Ascend 910B is in production and shipping at volume, which sets a floor on yield adequacy. What is not documented is the cost per working unit relative to an H100 equivalent when subsidy accounting is stripped out. The availability argument carries the round. Round 4 to China on availability grounds, with an asterisk on sustainability. The win is structural, grounded in access rather than efficiency, and that distinction matters for the final ruling. Before the verdict, the judge is obligated to entertain the strongest version of the losing case. The skeptical verdict risks a category error. The H100 comparison assumes the contest is fought on Nvidia's terms. Maximally optimized workloads run by teams fluent in Nvidia tooling, evaluated by Western benchmarking bodies. Huawei does not need to win that contest. It needs to be adequate for the Chinese hyperscaler market, where the alternative is not an H100, but no advanced artificial intelligence accelerator at all. On that framing, software ecosystem immaturity is a transition cost, not a permanent ceiling, and transition costs fall as engineers retrain and as library coverage widens. The yield and cost argument also looks different over a multi-year horizon. A process node matures, yields improve. Subsidy-driven volume creates the production runs that drive manufacturing learning curves downward. A verdict issued today may not survive 2026. The dissent is honest, and the judge has entertained it at length. But it asks the skeptics to accept a future that has not arrived as evidence against a present that is documented. The decisive round goes to the skeptics on the record as it stands. The dissent earns an asterisk, not a reversal. The Ascend 910B is a real chip running real workloads at real scale inside China. That much is not in dispute. The bullish claim that it has leapfrogged Nvidia survives in exactly one dimension: Availability. For a Chinese artificial intelligence developer locked out of Nvidia's export-controlled tiers, Huawei wins by default in the markets where Nvidia is absent. In every other dimension measured here, independently verified throughput, sustained memory bandwidth under production conditions, and software ecosystem depth, the H100 retains a lead that the current evidence supports. The restriction that was supposed to remove China from the artificial intelligence hardware race instead produced a domestically competitive alternative that is closing rounds it was expected to forfeit. That is the real story. Not a leapfrog, not a surrender, but a fight that the export controls made longer and stranger than either side planned. The chip that was supposed to stay behind the frontier is the one now forcing a recount. Which round do you think the evidence actually supports flipping? If you have run workloads on Ascend hardware, the ecosystem round in particular is one the judge would revisit with better data. Put your results in the comments. And if you want the verdict, when independent benchmarks finally land, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is the round that changes everything.